The graveyard shift usually meant cold coffee and quiet drunks, but at 2:14 a.m., the diner's glass door shattered, dragging the violent storm and the thick metallic stench of copper inside. The man bleeding out on the pastry counter wasn't a random casualty. He was Declan Fitzpatrick, the untouchable king of Chicago's underworld. His heart was failing. His ruthless enforcers were completely out of options. With rival hitmen closing in and no surgeon in sight, the city's most feared predator was already a ghost. Absolutely no one could save him. Until the waitress behind the counter put down her coffee pot and went toward to work. The Midnight Owl Diner sat on a forgotten stretch of highway just outside the Chicago city limits, a relic of the 1980s that smelled perpetually of burnt filter coffee, industrial bleach, and stale fryer grease. It was the kind of place that attracted the lost, the lonely, and those who preferred the shadows of the early morning hours. Nora Hayes preferred the graveyard shift. At 24, it paid the bills, kept her away from the daytime crowds, and offered a quiet sanctuary where she could study her old dog-eared nursing textbooks in peace. Outside, a torrential downpour battered the diner's large plate glass windows. The neon sign above the door, missing the W, so it read, "The Midnight OL," buzzed with an angry electrical hum. Inside, Nora wiped down the laminate surface of Booth 4, her mind miles away, calculating the cost of next month's rent for her cramped apartment in Logan Square. There were only two other people in the diner, an exhausted long-haul trucker named Pete dozing over a plate of old eggs, and old Mr. Henderson, a retired mechanic who was deaf in one ear and deep into a crossword puzzle. Then the bell above the door didn't just chime, it violently shattered the quiet. The glass door was kicked open with such force that it cracked against the doorstop. The howling wind and rain rushed in, bringing with it the metallic, unmistakable scent of copper. Two men stumbled over the threshold. The first was a mountain of a man, his face a mask of sheer panic, his tailored suit completely soaked through with rain and dark, thick blood. He was practically carrying the second man, who was a dead weight dragging across the floor. Pete the trucker jolted awake. One look at the heavy matte black Glock pistol gripped tightly in the standing man's hand was all it took. Pete scrambled out of his booth, threw a crumpled $20 bill on the table, and sprinted for the back exit without a word. Mr. Henderson didn't look up, too absorbed in a 6-letter word for tragedy. Nora stood frozen behind the counter, the damp rag clutched tightly in her hand. "Lock the damn door!" The standing man roared, his thick Irish lilt cracking with desperation. He had wild, sandy hair and eyes that darted around the room like a cornered animal. This was Finnick O'Connor, though Nora wouldn't know his name until much later. Nora didn't move. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I said lock the door." Finnick aimed the gun directly at her chest. "Now, sweetheart, unless you want to be collateral damage, survival instinct overrode terror." Nora dropped the rag, bolted to the front door, slammed it shut against the wind, and flipped the heavy deadbolt. She pulled the metal security blinds down her hands, shaking violently. When she turned back, Finnick had laid the other man flat on his back on top of the front counter, shoving napkin dispensers and salt shakers to the floor in a loud crash. The man on the counter was dressed in an expensive, bespoke charcoal Brioni suit, but the fabric was torn and slick with a massive amount of blood pooling beneath him. It was his face that made the breath catch in Nora's throat. Even pale and contorted in agony, his features were strikingly sharp. High cheekbones, a strong jawline covered in dark stubble, and pitch-black hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. She recognized him. Anyone in Chicago who read the papers or watched the local news knew that face. Declan Fitzpatrick, the newly crowned head of the Fitzpatrick Syndicate, a man rumored to control the docks, the unions, and half the politicians in the state. He was a phantom, a monster in a custom suit, and he was dying on her pastry display counter. "He's hit bad." Finnick gasped, his hands pressing frantically against Declan's right side, just beneath the ribs, and another wound near his collarbone. Blood was seeping through Finnick's thick fingers in a steady, terrifying rhythm. "The clinic is 20 minutes away. He won't make it. He's losing too much." "Call an ambulance," Nora managed to whisper, her voice trembling. "No cops, no hospitals," Finnick snarled, spinning to face her, the gun raised again. "The Russo family has spotters at every ER in a 10-mile radius. They tipped off the ambush. If he goes to a hospital, he's dead before he hits the operating table." Declan let out a low, guttural groan, his head lolling to the side. His lips were turning a dangerous shade of blue. The puddle of blood on the counter was spreading, dripping steadily onto the floor, with a sickening pat, pat, pat. "He's going into hypovolemic shock," Nora said. The words slipped out of her mouth before she could stop them. 2 years of nursing school before her mother's terminal illness forced her to drop out and take whatever jobs she could find, suddenly surged to the forefront of her paralyzed brain. Finnick stared at her, the gun wavering. "What? His blood volume is dropping too fast," Nora said, her voice growing firmer as the clinical detachment she had been trained to use kicked in. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the sight of a dying human being overrode the fact that he was a lethal criminal. "If you don't stop the arterial bleeding right now, his heart will stop in less than 3 minutes." "Then fix him," Finnick yelled, grabbing her by the apron strings and yanking her forward. "Do something, or I swear to God, you'll die right next to him." "Put the gun down, or he dies right here," Nora shouted back. The sudden authority in her voice shocked both of them. She slapped Finnick's heavy hand away from her apron. "I can't work with a gun in my face. Wash your hands. Use the sink behind the grill. Hot water, lots of soap. Now." Finnick blinked, utterly bewildered by the commanding tone of a waitress half his size, but the desperate wheeze escaping Declan's lips spurred him into action. He tucked the Glock into his waistband and rushed to the kitchen sink. Nora moved with a frantic, hyper-focused energy. She sprinted to the back office, kicking the door open to grab the industrial first aid kit mounted on the wall. She knew it wasn't enough. Band-aids and gauze wouldn't stop a severed artery. She ran past the kitchen, grabbing 2 clean white linen aprons, a bottle of high-proof cheap vodka they kept under the counter for Mr. Henderson's special coffees, and a heavy roll of silver duct tape. Returning to the front, Nora shoved Finnick aside. "Hold the flashlight from your phone over him. Keep it steady." She unscrewed the vodka and poured it directly over her own hands, wincing at the sting before pouring a generous amount over Declan's torn chest and side. Declan's eyes flew open. They were a piercing, stormy grey, currently blown wide with shock and blinding pain. A raw, ragged scream tore from his throat, and his right hand shot out, wrapping around Nora's wrist with a grip like a steel vice. "Steady," Nora said, forcing herself to look directly into those terrifying eyes. "I know. It burns. You're shot. I have to find the bleeder." Declan's gaze was feverish, unfocused, but he locked onto her face. His grip on her wrist was bruising, but he didn't pull her away. He was fighting for air, his chest heaving irregularly. Nora took a pair of heavy kitchen shears from her pocket and cut away the ruined Brioni shirt, exposing the muscular, heavily tattooed expanse of his chest. The collarbone wound was a through-and-through messy but missing major vessels. It was the wound on his right flank that was the killer. Dark, oxygen-depleted blood was pulsing out in a steady rhythm. The liver, or a major abdominal vein, was nicked. "Gauze," Nora demanded. Finnick practically shoved the entire box into her hands. She packed the side wound with an immense amount of sterile gauze, but it soaked through almost instantly. "It's too deep. Pressure isn't enough," she muttered, panic threatening to break her clinical facade. "The artery is retracted. I need to cauterize it." "Cauterize?" Finnick yelled. "Are you insane? You're a diner waitress." "I'm all you've got," Nora snapped. "Go to the grill. There's a metal icing spatula hanging on the rack. Turn the gas burner on high. Heat the metal until it's glowing red." "Do it." Finnick didn't argue. He ran to the grill. The sharp click, click, click of the gas igniter filled the diner, followed by the roar of the blue flame. Nora looked down at Declan. He was fading again, his eyelids drooping. Hey, stay with me," she said, tapping his cheek firmly. "Don't close your eyes." Declan's lips moved. It was a faint whisper over the sound of the rain. She leaned in closer, her ear near his mouth. "Angel," he rasped, a bloody bubble forming at the corner of his mouth. "Are you the Grim Reaper?" "Not tonight," Nora whispered fiercely. "Tonight, I'm just a waitress." "It's hot," Finnick shouted, rushing over. He held the long metal spatula wrapped in a thick towel. The metal tip was glowing a violent, angry orange. "Hold his shoulders down," Nora instructed Finnick. "He's going to thrash. Use all your weight." Finnick leaned over his boss, pinning his broad shoulders against the pastry counter. Nora took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. She couldn't afford to hesitate. If she missed, she'd burn healthy tissue, and he'd still bleed out. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Declan. She pressed the glowing metal deep into the wound, right against the pulsing source of the blood. The hiss of searing flesh was sickening, accompanied immediately by the acrid, terrible smell of burnt meat and blood. Declan let out a roar, so deafening, so filled with absolute agony, that it vibrated the glass windows of the diner. His body arched violently off the counter, nearly throwing the massive Finnick off balance. Declan's hands blindly gripped the edges of the counter until his knuckles turned white, his eyes rolling back in his head, before he finally mercifully passed out completely from the pain. Nora pulled the spatula away, dropping it into the metal sink with a loud clang. She grabbed the clean linen aprons, folded them thickly, and pressed them hard over the cauterized wound, wrapping the heavy duct tape entirely around Declan's torso under his back and over his chest multiple times, binding the makeshift pressure dressing tightly to his body. She stood back, chest heaving, her own uniform covered in his blood. She watched his chest. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. It rose, then fell, shallowly but steadily. The blood was no longer pooling. Finnick checked his boss's pulse at the neck. He let out a breath that sounded like a sob. "He's alive. Jesus Christ, he's alive." 30 minutes later, the screech of tires announced the arrival of a sleek, black, unmarked medical van. 3 people rushed in, led by a sharp-eyed, elegant older woman carrying 2 massive black medical bags. This was Dr. Sofia Calvetti, the syndicate's underground trauma surgeon. Sofia took one look at the scene, the bloody counter, the vodka, the duct tape, and the scorched spatula in the sink. She quickly assessed Declan's vitals and the binding. She looked up at Nora, who was huddled by the coffee machines, shivering despite the heat of the diner. "You did this?" Sophia asked, her thick Italian accent clipping the words. Nora nodded numbly. "You saved his life," Sophia said quietly. "A millimeter to the left, and the liver would be gone. The cauterization was brutal but perfect. He would have been dead 20 minutes ago." The men quickly and efficiently transferred Declan onto a portable stretcher. As they rolled him toward the door, Finnick stopped in front of Nora. He reached into his blood-soaked jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of $100 bills bound in a rubber band. He dropped it onto the counter. It had to be at least $10,000. "You saw nothing tonight," Finnick said, his voice low and deadly serious. "No police, no talking to friends, no nothing. For your own sake, you forget this ever happened." Nora stared at the bloody money. When she looked up, the diner was empty. The only proof that the reigning king of the Chicago underworld had almost died on her counter was the puddle of blood on the floor and the metallic scent lingering in the air. 3 weeks passed. To Nora, they felt like an eternity suspended in a vacuum. She had spent the first 3 days scrubbing the diner with bleach until her hands were raw, trying to erase the phantom smell of scorched blood. She didn't touch the money. She hid the bloody stack of bills inside a hollowed-out medical textbook beneath her floorboards. Touching it felt like a curse. She scoured the local news every morning, expecting to see a headline about the death of Declan Fitzpatrick. But there was nothing. No obituaries, no gang war erupting in the streets. The syndicate's public fronts, shipping companies, and real estate firms operated flawlessly. It was as if the stormy night at the Midnight Owl had been a fever dream. Nora tried to return to her normal routine. She served eggs to Pete, the trucker poured coffee for Mr. Henderson, and went home to her cramped, drafty apartment on the 3rd floor of a brick walk-up. But the shadows had begun to stretch. It started with small things. A dark sedan idling at the end of her street when she walked home. A stranger in a trench coat sitting in booth 2, ordering nothing but black coffee and watching her every move until his shift ended. Nora told herself she was being paranoid. The Fitzpatrick syndicate had told her to forget, so they were ignoring her. That was how it worked, right? She was wrong. She just didn't know who was actually hunting her. It was a Tuesday evening, a rare night off. Nora was carrying a bag of groceries up the dimly lit narrow alley behind her apartment building. The street lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the dumpsters. "Nora Hayes." The voice came from the darkness near the fire escape. Nora froze her grip, tightening on the brown paper grocery bag. A man stepped out into the dim light. He wasn't one of the men from the diner. He was lean, dressed in a cheap leather jacket, with a jagged scar running from his ear down to his collar. He had a cruel, asymmetrical smile. Behind him, 2 more men emerged from the shadows, blocking the exit to the street. "Who are you?" Nora asked, backing up slowly until her shoulders hit the rough brick wall. "Name's Dominic," the scarred man said casually, pulling a long, serrated hunting knife from his belt. "I work for Tobias Russo. You might have heard of him." Nora's blood ran cold. The Russo family. The rivals. The ones who had orchestrated the hit on Declan. "I don't know who that is," Nora lied, her voice trembling. "I don't have any money. Just take the groceries." Dominic laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "We don't want your apples, sweetheart. 3 weeks ago, we had a very specific target, dead to rights on Highway 41. Put 2 bullets in him. Watched him bleed. He should have died in the gutter." But somehow our inside guy tells us he survived. And rumor has it the car was spotted parked outside a filthy little diner before they made it to their private clinic. He took a step closer. The blade of the knife caught the faint light. Toby Russo is very upset. He spent a lot of money setting up that hit. He wants to know exactly how Declan Fitzpatrick survived, and he wants to make an example out of the Good Samaritan who interfered. "I don't know what you're talking about," Nora said, her chest heaving in panic. She looked wildly for an escape, but the alley was a dead end. "Grab her," Dominic snapped to his men. "Put her in the trunk. Toby wants to peel her apart himself." The two large men lunged forward. Nora screamed, throwing the heavy bag of groceries directly into the face of the first man. Cans of soup and oranges exploded onto the pavement. She tried to dart past them, but a heavy hand grabbed her hair, yanking her back so violently she saw stars. She was thrown against the brick wall. The breath knocked out of her lungs. Dominic stepped up, pressing the flat, cold steel of his blade against her cheek. "Stupid girl, you're going to scream a lot tonight." Suddenly, the roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet of the alley. A sleek, heavily armored black SUV tore into the narrow space, its high beams blindingly bright. It didn't slow down. It slammed directly into one of Dominic's men, crushing his leg against the metal dumpster with a sickening crunch. The man screamed, collapsing to the ground. Dominic spun around, shielding his eyes from the headlights, raising his gun. Before he could pull the trigger, the back doors of the SUV flew open. 4 men poured out, moving with terrifying synchronized precision. Suppressed automatic weapons hissed in the night air. Pft, pft, pft. Dominic's second man dropped instantly, clutching a ruined knee. Dominic himself took a bullet to the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his knife clattering into the darkness. "Don't move, Russo scum," a familiar, gruff Irish voice echoed. Finnick stepped into the light, a heavy assault rifle leveled at Dominic's head. "Or I'll paint this wall with your brains." Nora slid down the brick wall, her knees finally giving out. She was shaking uncontrollably, staring at the sudden carnage. The back door of the SUV opened a little wider. A figure stepped out into the damp night air. He moved slower than before, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane. But his presence was just as suffocatingly powerful. Declan Fitzpatrick was dressed impeccably in a dark navy suit. The pale, near-death spectre from the diner was gone. In his place was the apex predator of Chicago, his stormy grey eyes locked directly onto Nora. He walked toward her, the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of his cane echoing over the groans of the bleeding men. He stopped right in front of her and looked down. "Dominic," Declan said, not taking his eyes off Nora. His voice was smooth, deep, and laced with absolute authority. "Tell Toby Russo that if he ever sends men into my territory again, I won't just kill his soldiers. I'll burn his entire estate to the ground while he sleeps inside it." "Go to hell, Fitzpatrick," Dominic spat through gritted teeth. Declan didn't even look at him. He simply nodded his head. Finnick stepped forward and hit Dominic across the jaw, with the butt of his rifle knocking him out cold. Declan finally crouched down, wincing slightly as the movement clearly pulled at his healing wounds. He offered Nora a large, warm hand. "I told you I was just a waitress," Nora whispered, staring at his hand as if it were a loaded gun. "Your man told me to forget. I tried to forget." "I know," Declan said softly, the ruthless mob boss facade softening for a fraction of a second. "And I tried to leave you be. But the Russos don't believe in coincidences, and my men have been watching you to make sure they didn't figure it out. Tonight they did. "So what now?" Nora asked, tears of sheer exhaustion finally spilling over her cheeks. "You saved me. We're even. Please just let me go." Declan's jaw tightened. He grabbed her hand gently but firmly, pulling her to her feet. The heat radiating from his grip was a stark contrast to the cold alley. "We aren't even Nora," Declan said, his gaze intense, capturing her completely. "You breathed life back into a dead man. In my world, a life debt is a bond of blood. Toby Russo knows who you are now. If I leave you here, you're dead by tomorrow morning." "I can run," she protested. "I can disappear." "You can't hide from them," Declan replied, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "But they can't touch what belongs to me." Nora's eyes widened. "I don't belong to you." "You do now," Declan said, turning toward the open door of the SUV. "Get in the car, Angel. Your shift at the diner is permanently over." The Fitzpatrick estate in Lake Forest was not a house. It was a fortress masquerading as a monument to old money, situated on 10 acres of manicured land overlooking the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. The limestone mansion was surrounded by 12-foot wrought-iron gates, high-definition thermal security cameras, and men in tailored suits who walked with the stiff, rigid posture of ex-military contractors. Nora woke up enveloped in heavy, cool Port-Holt linens. The mattress was softer than anything she had ever slept on, and the room was massive, decorated in muted tones of slate and cream. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a terrifyingly beautiful view of the lake, but when she tried the polished brass handle of the French doors leading to the balcony, it didn't budge. They were locked from the outside. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the lingering exhaustion of the previous night. She was a prisoner, a very comfortable, very expensive prisoner. She threw off the covers, realizing she was wearing a silk nightgown that certainly didn't belong to her. Her jeans and blood-stained diner uniform were nowhere to be seen. She found a heavy cashmere robe draped over a velvet armchair, tied it tightly around her waist, and marched toward the bedroom's heavy oak door. It opened smoothly, revealing a long, carpeted hallway, lined with original oil paintings and antique sconces. Waiting outside her door, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, was Finnick. He looked far less frantic than the night at the Midnight Owl, dressed in a crisp white shirt and a charcoal vest, though the noticeable bulge of a shoulder holster ruined the refined aesthetic. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," Finnick said, his Irish brogue thick but polite. "I trust you slept well. Mrs. Hughes, the housekeeper, left fresh clothes for you in the adjoining dressing room. Breakfast is being served in the solarium." "I don't want breakfast," Nora said, her voice tight. "I want my clothes, my phone, and a cab back to Logan Square." Finnick offered a sympathetic yet entirely immovable smile. "I'm afraid that's out of the question. The boss left strict instructions. You are not to leave the main house without an escort, and you are certainly not returning to your apartment. It's already been cleared out. Your belongings are being brought here." "He cleared out my apartment." Nora's voice rose, echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling. "He can't do that. This is kidnapping. This is relocation for your continued breathing, sweetheart," a new voice interrupted. Nora turned to see Dr. Sophia Calvetti walking briskly down the hall, carrying a sleek leather medical bag. She gave Nora a curt nod. "Tobias Russo's men burned your apartment building to the ground at 4 o'clock this morning. A gas leak officially. Unofficially, 3 men with jerry cans and a match. If Declan hadn't pulled you out of that alley, you'd be ash." The words hit Nora like a physical blow. Her knees felt weak, and she leaned against the heavy door frame for support. Her nursing books, her mother's old photographs, the meager life she had painstakingly built, all gone. A wave of profound loss washed over her quickly, followed by a searing, blinding anger. "Where is he?" Nora demanded, her eyes flashing. Finnick hesitated, looking at Dr. Calvetti. The doctor merely shrugged. "He's in his study. He just finished his IV antibiotics. Try not to raise his blood pressure." Nora didn't wait for an escort. She pushed past Finnick, navigating the labyrinthine hallways until she found a set of massive mahogany double doors flanked by two more silent, imposing guards. They stepped aside as she approached, opening the doors for her. The study smelled of leather expensive espresso and the faint, sharp tang of antiseptic. Declan Fitzpatrick sat behind a massive desk carved from dark walnut. He looked pale. The dark circles under his stormy grey eyes, a stark contrast to his sharp cheekbones. He was wearing a dark Henley shirt that accommodated the heavy bandages beneath, examining a stack of financial documents with ruthless efficiency. He looked up as she stormed in. The annoyance on his face vanished, replaced by a guarded, unreadable expression. "You burned my life down," Nora said, her voice shaking with rage. She marched right up to the edge of his desk. "Toby Russo burned your apartment down," Declan corrected smoothly, setting his gold Mont Blanc pen down. "I warned you they wouldn't stop. I simply made sure you weren't inside it." "And what now?" she yelled, throwing her hands up. "I just live here, a pet waitress in a silk cage. I have a life, Declan. I have nursing school to pay for. I have debts." Declan stood up. The movement was slow, a deliberate attempt to mask the pain radiating from his healing side, but the sheer size of him still dominated the room. He picked up a sleek black American Express Centurion card from his desk and tossed it onto the polished wood between them. "Your debts are paid," Declan said, his voice a low rumble. "Your tuition at Chicago Memorial's nursing program has been paid in full for the next 4 years under an anonymous endowment. Anything else you need, you use that." Nora stared at the black card as if it were a venomous snake. "You think you can just buy me? Buy away the fact that you dragged me into a mob war?" Declan rounded the desk, limping slightly, until he was standing mere inches from her. The height difference was staggering. Nora had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. Up close, she could see the faint tension lines around his mouth, the physical toll of holding an empire together, while his body was trying to knit itself back together. "I don't buy people, Nora," Declan said, his tone softening, losing the icy edge of the Mafia Boss and revealing the weary man underneath. "I protect what is mine. You saved my life. You put your hands inside my chest and pulled me back from the dark. Because of that, Russo put a target on your back. Until Tobias Russo is dead and his syndicate is dismantled, you stay here. You will be safe. You will be provided for. But you will not leave these gates." "And how long will that take?" she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold dread. Declan reached out his large, calloused thumb, gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch was startlingly tender, sending a jolt of electricity down her spine. "As long as it takes for the streets to run clean," he answered softly. "Welcome to the family, Angel." 2 weeks blurred into a strange, suffocating routine. Nora was given free rein of the estate's interior and the walled gardens, but always under the watchful eyes of the security detail. She spent her days in the massive 2-story library, poring over first-edition medical texts and modern journals, Declan had specially ordered for her. She learned the rhythms of the house. She learned that Declan drank his coffee black, slept less than 4 hours a night, and held meetings in the basement boardroom that left his men looking pale and terrified. She also learned that despite his ruthless reputation, he possessed a quiet, terrifying intellect. He didn't rule by screaming. He ruled with a surgical, calculated precision, and she learned that he was watching her too. Often she would look up from her books to find him standing in the doorway of the library, leaning on his silver-handled cane, just observing her. The air between them was thick, charged with an unspoken tension that hovered somewhere between gratitude, captivity, and a dangerous, simmering attraction. He never pushed her boundaries, but his presence was a constant, heavy blanket wrapping around her new reality. The fragile peace shattered on a Thursday night. A heavy, oppressive humidity had settled over Lake Michigan, bringing with it a violent thunderstorm that rattled the mansion's windows. Declan had called an emergency meeting of his inner circle. Some of his highest-ranking capos, including Finnick and a sleek, sharp-eyed man named Silas, were gathered in the main dining room, operating under the guise of a catered dinner. Nora had retreated to the library, trying to focus on a chapter about cardiovascular pharmacology, but the raised, muffled voices echoing down the hallway made it impossible. The syndicate was bleeding money. Russo's men had hijacked 3 of their shipping containers at the port of Chicago, and the retaliation was becoming costly. Around 11 p.m., the heavy oak doors of the dining room banged open. Nora stepped out of the library just in time to see Silas stumble into the hallway. The capo's face was chalk white, glistening with a sudden profuse sweat. He clutched his chest, his eyes rolling back in his head as he collapsed onto the imported Persian rug, his body instantly seizing in violent, rigid convulsions. Chaos erupted. Finnick rushed out his gun, drawn instinctively, scanning the empty hallway for a threat. Declan was right behind him, his face a mask of cold fury. "Get Sophia now!" Declan roared, dropping to his knees beside his seizing lieutenant. Nora didn't think. The adrenaline spike wiped away the fear of the heavily armed men surrounding her. She sprinted down the hall, sliding to her knees beside Silas. "Move!" she ordered Declan, shoving his shoulder. "He's having a heart attack," Finnick yelled, pulling his phone out. "It's not a heart attack." Nora snapped her eyes, darting over Silas's face. She grabbed his jaw, forcing his mouth open. She leaned in close, sniffing the air near his lips. There was a faint, sickly sweet scent, like bitter almonds mixed with garlic. His pupils are pinpoint. He's cyanotic. He's rigid, not fibrillating. She looked up at Declan, her heart hammering. What did he eat? What did he drink? We all drank the same scotch. Macallan, 25. Declan said, his mind racing. But Silas takes medication. He took a pill right before dinner. Who gave it to him? Nora demanded. Declan's eyes darkened, a terrifying realization dawning on him. He looked up at one of the younger soldiers, standing by the dining room door, a quiet, unassuming driver named Leo. Leo took one look at Declan's face, turned, and bolted for the service stairs. "Take him alive!" Declan barked at Finnick. Finnick didn't hesitate, sprinting after the traitor. Nora turned her attention back to Silas. "It's an organophosphate or a synthetic neurotoxin. It was in the pill casing. His respiratory system is shutting down." Doctor. Sofia Calvetti rushed down the hallway, her medical bag swinging. Nora didn't wait for her to ask questions. "Neurotoxin poisoning likely ingested via capsule 10 minutes ago." Nora fired off the information with rapid-fire precision. "He needs atropine max dose right now, and we need to intubate or he's going to suffocate on his own secretions." Sophia didn't argue. She threw the bag open, pulling out a pre-filled syringe of atropine and tossing a laryngoscope and an endotracheal tube to Nora. "You secure the airway. I'll push the meds." Nora's hands were remarkably steady. She tilted Silas's head back expertly, sliding the metal blade of the laryngoscope past his tongue, illuminating the vocal cords. "I'm in," she said, threading the plastic tube down his throat, while Sophia plunged the needle into Silas's thigh. For 2 agonizing minutes, Nora manually squeezed the ambibag, forcing oxygen into the capo's paralyzed lungs. Slowly, the violent seizures began to subside. The terrible blue tint to his lips started to fade back to a pale, sickly pink. Sophia checked his pulse. "It's stabilizing. We need to move him to the subterranean clinic now to put him on a ventilator." As the guards rushed forward to lift the unconscious Silas onto a portable stretcher, Nora slumped back against the mahogany wainscoting. Her chest, heaving her hands, suddenly trembling uncontrollably as the adrenaline left her system. The hallway cleared, leaving only Nora and Declan. Declan stood above her. The storm outside raged, a flash of lightning illuminating the harsh, violent angles of his face. The realization of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. Tobias Russo had bribed one of Declan's own men. The war had breached the fortress walls. Declan reached down, gripping Nora by the upper arms, and pulled her smoothly to her feet. He didn't let go. He backed her up gently until her shoulders hit the wall. He was close, too close, his large frame caging her in. He smelled of rain, expensive scotch, and the dangerous metallic scent of a man ready to go to war. "You did it again," Declan whispered, his voice incredibly rough. His stormy eyes searched her face, mapping every line of her exhaustion. "My fortress is compromised. My men are bought. And yet the waitress from the midnight shift is the only thing standing between my family and the grave." "I'm a nurse," Nora breathed, unable to look away from his intense gaze. "It's what I do." "You're a goddamn miracle," Declan corrected him, his voice dropping to a low, reverent murmur. Before she could process the shift in his tone, Declan's hand slid from her arm up to her neck, his fingers threading into her hair. He leaned down and his mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate bruising and fueled by the adrenaline of near death and betrayal. It tasted of scotch and absolute possession. Nora gasped against his lips, her hands instinctively coming up to push against his chest, but the moment her fingers touched the solid muscle beneath his shirt, her body betrayed her. She gripped his shirt tightly, pulling him closer, returning the fierce, unyielding pressure of his kiss. For a man who lived his life in control, Declan kissed her like a man drowning, and she was the only air left in the room. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathing heavily. Declan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Leo will tell us everything Russo is planning," Declan said softly, his tone deadly, a stark contrast to the intimacy of their position. "And then I am going to end this war. But understand this, Nora." He opened his eyes, pinning her with a look of absolute terrifying certainty. "You aren't just a debt anymore. You're mine." The storm broke just before dawn, leaving a heavy, stagnant fog that swallowed the manicured grounds of the Lake Forest estate. Inside, the air felt just as thick, choked with the metallic scent of impending violence. Nora sat on the edge of her bed, fully dressed in black slacks and a heavy sweater. She couldn't sleep. Her lips still burned from the memory of Declan's kiss, a collision of 2 completely different worlds. It was a stark admission, that she was no longer just a medical asset or a debt to be paid. She was entangled in the roots of the Fitzpatrick syndicate. Down in the soundproofed basement, Declan and Finnick were dismantling the traitor Leo. Nora's stomach churned at the thought of a mafia interrogation, but her clinical mind couldn't stop calculating the brutal anatomy of the violence happening below. At 6 a.m., the bedroom door opened. Declan stood in the frame. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension and splattered with small, dark droplets of blood. His face was a mask of unyielding stone, but his stormy grey eyes softened fractionally as they found her. "Is it over?" Nora asked, her voice raspy in the oppressive silence. Declan walked straight to the adjoining bathroom, turned on the faucet, and began scrubbing his hands with a harsh bar of soap. "Leo sang," Declan said over the running water. "Russo threatened his younger sister, cut her into pieces if he didn't slip the neurotoxin to Silas." Nora leaned against the bathroom doorframe. "So Russo is isolating you?" "Worse." Declan shut off the water, tossing the towel aside. Exhaustion bled through his impenetrable facade. "Leo was just the delivery boy. Russo has someone higher up, someone who handed over security rotations blueprints and the schedule for the underground clinic." Nora's blood ran cold. "Who?" "Barrett," Declan stated flatly. The name hit Nora like a physical blow. Barrett was the head of estate security. He was the former Marine who had personally escorted Nora through the gardens and stood guard outside her door. "He's been feeding Russo information for 6 months, Declan continued. "Russo promised him $2 million and the South Side routes. Barrett is the reason I ended up bleeding out on your counter." "Where is he now?" Nora's eyes darted toward the hallway. Declan checked his heavy Rolex. "He's on the day shift, scheduled to arrive at the main gate in 20 minutes. When he swipes his card, the gates lock him in. Finnick and I are waiting in the gatehouse. We take him alive, find Russo, and end this." He reached out his clean hands, framing Nora's face. His thumbs gently stroked her cheekbones. "Stay in this room. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me or Finnick. Do you understand, Declan? I promise me." He commanded, his voice rough with desperation. "Barrett is a cornered animal. If he realizes we know, he will leverage the one thing in this house I cannot afford to lose." He kissed her forehead, a lingering, protective press of his lips, before striding out. The heavy door clicked shut, and the deadbolt slid into place with a definitive thud. Nora paced the room, watching the fog swirl against the floor-to-ceiling windows. 7 o'clock came and went, then 7:15. No gunfire, no shouts, just the suffocating silence of the massive house. At 7:30, the power abruptly cut out. The soft glow of the lamps vanished. The hum of the central air died. The backup generators failed to kick in. A blackout of this scale meant the main electrical grid and fail-safes had been manually severed. Only the head of security had those codes. The handle of her bedroom door rattled. Nora backed away, her heart hammering. The sharp electronic beep of a master override keycard echoed in the gloom. The deadbolt retracted. Barrett stepped into the room. His calm, professional demeanor entirely gone. He was sweating, his eyes wild, gripping a suppressed Heckler & Koch pistol. "Get away from the window," Barrett ordered, closing the door behind him. "Keep your hands where I can see them." "Declan knows," Nora said, forcing her clinical detachment to the surface. "Finnick is waiting for you at the gate." "I know," Barrett sneered. That's why I came through the old service tunnels by the lake. Fitzpatrick made a mistake leaving you up here alone while he hunted ghosts at the perimeter. He crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbing Nora roughly and pressing the cold steel suppressor directly against her temple. "Walk," he barked, shoving her toward the door. "You're my golden ticket. Fitzpatrick will let me walk out the front door to keep your brains inside your skull." As Barrett forced her down the sweeping grand staircase, Nora's mind raced. She remembered the anatomy charts and pressure points. Barrett was larger and heavily armed. Fighting directly was suicide. But she wasn't just a waitress anymore. She had pulled a mafia king back from the dead. She knew exactly how bodies worked and how they failed. They reached the massive marble foyer. The reinforced mahogany front doors were 50 feet away. "Stop right there, Barrett." The roar echoed from the second-floor landing. Declan stood at the top of the stairs, a matte black assault rifle leveled perfectly at Barrett's chest. Finnick materialized from the dining room archway, his Glock drawn. 2 more guards stepped from the library. They had him boxed in. "Drop the weapon, you treacherous son of a bitch," Declan commanded, his voice vibrating with homicidal rage. "Drop it, or I will peel the skin from your bones while you watch." Barrett didn't flinch. He yanked Nora tightly against his chest, jamming the gun harder against her temple. "Back off, Fitzpatrick!" Barrett screamed, his finger white on the trigger. "Lower the weapons, or I paint this marble with her blood. Have your men open the doors and bring an armored SUV around." "Now." Declan's jaw clenched. He looked at Nora. Her eyes were wide, but she wasn't crying. She stared right back at him, communicating a silent, desperate message. "Don't let him go." "You're a dead man," Declan said softly, the quiet tone more terrifying than his shouting. "Russo won't save you. Put the gun down, and I promise a quick death." "Open the doors!" Barrett screamed, taking a heavy step backward, dragging Nora with him. Nora knew this was her window. As Barrett shifted his weight, his balance momentarily faltered. In a split second, Nora dropped all her body weight, turning herself completely limp, while simultaneously driving her elbow violently backward. She aimed with pinpoint accuracy, burying the strike into Barrett's floating ribs, a vicious blow to the unprotected soft tissue over his liver. Barrett gasped. His body instinctively recoiled from the sharp, blinding pain, loosening his grip for a fraction of a second. Nora threw herself to the marble floor. "Take him!" she screamed. The foyer erupted. 3 suppressed shots hissed in perfect unison, 1 from Finnick, 2 from Declan. The heavy caliber rounds threw Barrett backward, crashing him through the glass pane of an antique grandfather clock. He slid to the floor dead before the shattered glass finished raining down. Silence slammed back into the room, broken only by the ringing in Nora's ears. Declan was down the stairs before the smoke cleared. He dropped to his knees, his rifle clattering to the floor, and hauled Nora into his chest. His hands shook violently as he checked her for bullet holes. "Are you hit?" he demanded, the ruthless boss replaced entirely by a terrified man. "Nora, look at me." "I'm fine," she gasped, burying her face in his neck, inhaling the scent of gunpowder. "I'm okay." Declan crushed her to him, his grip bruising. Finnick kicked the gun away from Barrett's lifeless hand and pulled an encrypted burner phone from his tactical vest. "Boss," Finnick said quietly. "Last sent message was a location, a warehouse in Fulton Market. Russo is waiting for him." Declan slowly pulled back from Nora. The fear in his stormy eyes hardened back into impenetrable ice. He stood up, pulling her to her feet. "Get Sophia," Declan ordered Finnick. Prep the mobile trauma unit. Assemble every man. We're going to Fulton Market. Nora tightened her grip on Declan's hand. I'm going with you. No, you're staying here. You almost died on my counter. Nora fired back, her voice ringing with absolute authority. Silas almost died in your hallway. Barrett just tried to put a bullet in my head. There is no safe anymore. If you're going to war, you need a medic. Declan stared at her, measuring the unyielding fire in her eyes. The waitress who cowered behind the diner counter was gone, replaced by a woman forged in the fires of his world. A slow, dark smirk spread across his face. Finnick, Declan called out, never breaking eye contact with Nora. Get the lady a Kevlar vest. The Fulton Market district in downtown Chicago was a labyrinth of decaying industrial meat-packing plants. Tobias Rousseau's warehouse sat at the end of Kinsey Street, a sprawling brick monolith that had served as his quiet processing hub for years. At 9:45 a.m. that quiet was permanently shattered. 4 armor-plated Escalades tore through the chain-link perimeter, screeching to a halt in the central courtyard. In the back of the third vehicle, Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She wore a heavy Kevlar vest over her sweater, a sleek medical bag strapped to her chest. Beside her, Dr. Sofia Calvetti calmly loaded a pump-action shotgun. Stay low behind the engine block, Sofia instructed. You fix the holes, we make them. Before Nora could process the order, Declan stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by Finnick and 12 heavily armed enforcers. There was no hesitation. Finnick marched to the reinforced steel side door and blew the hinges off with 2 deafening blasts. Declan kicked the ruined metal inward, and the Fitzpatrick Syndicate poured into the building. The firefight erupted instantly. It was a chaotic symphony of automatic weapons and shattering concrete. Rousseau's men, expecting a lone hostage handoff, were completely unprepared for a full-scale siege. Medic! The panicked shout pierced the deafening gunfire. Go! Sofia yelled, shoving Nora's shoulder. Nora sprinted across the open concrete bullets, pinging against the brick walls above. She slid onto the oily floor beside Marco, one of Declan's younger soldiers, who was clutching a through-and-through wound to his thigh. Fear vanished, swallowed entirely by her clinical training. Nora ripped open his pant leg, applied a rapid tourniquet high above the knee, and packed the wound with hemostatic gauze. You're stable, she commanded, cranking the windlass down tight. Don't move. She looked up through the macabre cover of swinging meat hooks. Rousseau's men were falling back, overwhelmed by Declan's unyielding assault. Declan moved through the chaos with terrifying grace, his rifle barking in controlled bursts. He was a king fighting in the mud with his soldiers. At the far end of the warehouse, inside an elevated glass-enclosed office, Tobias Rousseau was screaming into a radio. His silver suit was dusted with debris as he frantically called for reinforcements that would never arrive. Declan spotted him. Covering fire, he roared, dropping his empty rifle and drawing a custom 1911 pistol. As Finnick laid down a suppressive wall of lead, Declan vaulted a conveyor belt and sprinted up the metal stairs, ignoring the bullets ricocheting around him. He kicked the remnants of the office door off its frame. Nora scrambled forward, staying low behind a stack of crates to keep him in sight. Inside, Rousseau raised a submachine gun. Declan didn't blink. He fired twice. Bang! Bang! The first hollow point round shattered Rousseau's right shoulder, sending his weapon clattering to the floor. The second round caught his right knee, dropping the rival boss with a sickening crunch. The warehouse fell eerily silent, save for the groans of the wounded. Seeing their boss fall, the remaining Rousseau soldiers surrendered. Finnick's men moved in quickly, zip-tying them to support pillars. Declan stood over Russo, smoke lazily drifting from his pistol. "You're done, Toby. Your roots are mine. Your name is erased." Russo spat a wad of blood. "The feds are watching Fitzpatrick. They'll bury you." "Let them try," Declan said softly, aiming the pistol directly between Russo's eyes. "Declan, wait." Nora's voice echoed up the stairs. She pushed past the shattered door frame into the bloody office. Declan's eyes flicked to her, though his gun didn't waver. "Get out of here, Nora." "He's bleeding out from the femoral," Nora said, pointing to the expanding pool of dark blood around Russo's shattered knee. "If you shoot him in the head, the feds will find the forensics. It's an execution. But if he bleeds out, it's just another casualty of a gang shootout." Declan stared at her. An entirely new level of respect and dark amusement washed over his face. He looked down at Russo, whose pale face twisted in panic as the reality of his severed artery set in. "You hear that, Toby?" Declan said, slowly lowering the hammer and holstering his weapon. "The waitress says you get to bleed." Russo stared at Nora, agony and terror warring in his eyes. "Help me! You're a nurse! Please!" Nora looked down at him. Her face was completely impassive. She thought of her apartment turning to ash, the hunting knife in the alley, and the gun Barrett had pressed to her temple just an hour ago. She unbuckled her medical bag and set it deliberately on the desk just out of his reach. "I'm off the clock," she said softly. She turned her back on the dying boss and walked over to Declan. His chest heaved as he reached out, wrapping a strong arm securely around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. They walked out of the office together, leaving Russo's frantic, wet gasps to fade behind them. Descending the stairs, they stepped over the shattered remnants of their enemies. Finnick gave a sharp nod, ushering the remaining men toward the waiting vehicles. As they stepped out of the dark warehouse, the mid-morning Chicago sun broke through the heavy clouds, casting a brilliant light over the city skyline. Declan stopped by the open door of his Escalade. He looked down at Nora, gently brushing a streak of dirt and blood from her cheek. "It's over," he whispered, his voice gravelly with exhaustion. "The city is ours. You never have to look over your shoulder again." Nora studied the harsh lines of his face and the unyielding loyalty in his stormy eyes. She had saved him on a dirty diner counter, and in return he had burned the world down for her. "I know," she said, leaning up to press her lips to his. "Take me home, Declan." He smiled a real, genuine smile that finally chased the shadows away. He lifted her into the armored SUV, climbing in beside her, as the convoy roared to life, disappearing into the heart of the city they now ruled together. In the end, survival in the criminal underworld isn't about who pulls the trigger the fastest. It's about who holds the power to heal when the bullets stop flying. Nora Hayes didn't just save a dying mafia boss on a rainy Tuesday night. She resurrected an empire and forged a new unbreakable dynasty. Declan Fitzpatrick realized that true power wasn't found in a loaded gun or an offshore bank account, but in the hands of the woman willing to walk through fire by his side. The Midnight Owl Diner is long gone, replaced by a state-of-the-art trauma clinic, funded by an anonymous benefactor, run flawlessly by a woman who traded her waitress apron for a crown. Blood forged their bond, violence tested it, but unwavering loyalty sealed it. They are the undeniable king and queen of Chicago, two halves of a miraculously saved, dangerously beautiful life.